Good morning, Eastside Church of Christ, and happy Father's Day to you. Let's do something. Let's honor our fathers today. If you're a dad, would you stand up and let us give you some recognition this morning? That is wonderful. Thank you for what you do. And I'm so glad that we heard from the precious kids this morning in honoring their fathers, or at least attempting to honor their fathers. All of us who have fathers are blessed to have them. We attempt to honor them. And some of you have fathers who've gone on to be with the Lord, and may God bless you as you grieve that loss, but may God also give you the comfort of knowing where they are, all those who put their faith in Jesus Christ. I've come to be convinced that everyone knows my dad. To prove that point, two weeks ago, I went fishing. I went fishing in Port Aransas. I signed up for a party boat that takes 30 people. The first 30 who sign up for this very short snapper season. So most of the people I'm on the boat with, none of them, except for maybe one, I'd ever met before. And they've come from mostly Dallas, Houston areas, the major metropolitan areas of Texas. But as we were fishing out there, entered a conversation, pretty rough conversation because it was rough seas. But I found someone who had a Snyder connection, and I said, well, maybe you've heard of my father, Jerry Starr. And he said, see, the barber has all the stories all the time? And I said, that would be him. Now, there's another character that we're going to look at this morning, his story. His name was Isaac, and surely wherever he went in the Near East, he could say, maybe you've heard of my father, Abraham, and everyone would have said, oh yeah, I've heard of him. For Abraham was very famous. In fact, some, if he had gone into some palaces, would have said, oh yeah, isn't he the Hebrew who always seems to be getting richer even as the rest of us seem to be getting poorer? And Isaac would have had to say, yeah, that would be him. And this story of Abraham and Isaac, the son of the promise, is perhaps the most well-versed story of a father and child in the Old Testament. So we'll have two scripture readings this morning that are seemingly unrelated, but hang with me and it'll all work out okay. The first from Genesis chapter 22, and I invite you to turn to your Bibles. Genesis chapter 22. Sometime later, God tested Abraham. He said to him, Abraham, here I am, he replied. And God said, take your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac, and go to the region of Moriah. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on a mountain I will show you. Early the next morning, Abraham got up and loaded his donkey. He took with him 2 of his servants and his son Isaac. When he had cut enough wood for the burnt offering, he set out for the place God had told him about. On the 3rd day, Abraham looked up and saw the place in the distance. He said to his servant, stay here with the donkey while I and the boy go over there. We will worship, and then we will come back to you. Abraham took the wood for the burnt offering and placed it on his son Isaac, and he himself carried the fire and the knife. As the 2 of them went on together, Isaac spoke up and said to his father Abraham, Father? Yes, my son, Abraham replied. The fire and wood are here, Isaac said, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering? Abraham answered, God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son. And the 2 of them went on together. When they had reached the place God had told him about, Abraham built an altar there and arranged the wood on it. He bound his son Isaac and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Then he reached out his hand and took the knife to slay his son. But the angel of the Lord called out to him from heaven, Abraham, Abraham. Here I am, he replied. Do not lay a hand on the boy, he said. Do not do anything to him. Now I know that you fear God, because you have not withheld from me your son, your only son. Abraham looked up, and there in the thicket he saw a ram caught by its horns. He went over and took the ram and sacrificed it as a burnt offering instead of his son. So Abraham called the place, the Lord will provide. And to this day it is said, on the mountain of the Lord it will be provided. The angel of the Lord called Abraham from heaven a second time and said, I swear by myself, declares the Lord, that because you have done this and have not withheld your son, your only son, I will surely bless you and make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and the sand on the seashore. Your descendants will take possession of the cities of their enemies, and through your offspring all nations of the earth will be blessed because you have obeyed me. And from Ephesians chapter 3, verse 10. God's intent was that now, through the church, the manifold wisdom of God should be made known to the rulers and authorities in the heavenly realms. The word of the Lord. Let's get the 800-pound gorilla out of the way before we really dive in here. When we read this story as Christians, some of us have read it so long that we simply take it for granted and say this is the way that it is. But imagine that you had never heard this story before. Imagine that you're not a Christian. Imagine that you're not a person of faith, and you read this story in which God commands Abraham to take this son, the son of the promise, his only son whom he loves, and sacrifice him as an offering to God. How do you like them apples? Does the question arise in your mind, how could God do this? If not, may I suggest that it should. How could a being that we worship and who we claim is all good and all love order a person to gut his child to show his love for that deity? This is a stumbling block. Hear me, this is a stumbling block for a lot of people who don't know the Lord. As the late atheist apologist Christopher Hitchens said in his reflection on the story, if someone told me to take one of my 3 delightful children and kill them to prove that I love God, I would say that to them, no. And then he has stronger language besides no. Does that make sense? If someone told you, kill your child to show that you love God, you can identify with what Christopher Hitchens is saying. No. That's an abomination. That's a horrific thought. What kind of God could possibly command that? Well, a couple of possibilities I submit for your consideration. The first is, you've got to read to the end of the story. As some Jewish rabbis would say, the whole point of this story, in a land that was absolutely rife with child sacrifice, the whole point of this story is to say God doesn't accept that kind of sacrifice. God did not let Abraham kill Isaac. God would not let Abraham kill Isaac. God could not let Abraham kill Isaac. It's later on, but in the book of Leviticus, what's the prescription for a person who sacrifices his child to a god? Death. And my favorite is in Jeremiah. 3 times in the book of Jeremiah, when God is condemning people who practice child sacrifice, he says it this way, I didn't command it, and it didn't even enter my mind. Do you get that? It never even occurred to God that he would ask someone to kill a child. That's not in the nature of our God. It is not in the character of our God. God would never accept a child sacrifice. It's simply not who he is. The story read in isolation might disturb us, and maybe it should disturb us, but we've got to read the rest of the story. The whole story that's there, the whole story that's throughout the Old Testament and New. Our God is a God of love. He is the author of life. He creates life, and he urges each one of us to respect that life. So the obvious question becomes, why did God command this? And the text doesn't tell us. But here are two possibilities for your consideration of why God did this. And they're very related. They both have to do with idolatry. But one possibility is that Abraham is being asked by God. Remember, in a world that is absolutely filled with people who sacrifice their children to their heathen gods, perhaps the question to Abraham is, Abraham, do you love me, the true God, as much as the pagans love their false ones? Do you love me as much as these other worshipers love their gods? A second possibility is this. How long had Abraham waited for that child before he was born? Do you remember? Most people have to wait about 25, 30 years. How long did Abraham have to wait? Try 100, right? Abraham had waited for this child an entire lifetime and more. Do you think he loved Isaac? Does the text make it clear? Abraham, you take your son, your only son, whom you what? Love. Is it possible that Abraham, having wanted this all his life, was so enamored of that blessing of finally having a son, that relationship with his son was perhaps starting to crowd out his relationship with his God? And Abraham started enjoying the blessings of God more than he enjoyed God himself. I don't know which of those, if either, is an appropriate explanation for why God does this, but those questions should haunt us, and they should get under our skin a little bit. And we should ask ourselves, do we love our God as much as the world loves it? Because the world has a lot of gods. We were creatures who were made for worship. We can't help ourselves. We're going to worship something. And you've got all of the usual idols of position or power or status or money or pleasure that present themselves right now because we're in an election time. Those are really on display. Political agendas are on display, and people will do almost anything to get their political agenda out there. And God, in the midst of all of that, comes to us and says, there are people who are sacrificing just about everything for their false god. Do you love me that much? Or maybe He's asking us, do you love me, or do you love the blessings that I give you? Which do you crave more? Do you want me more, or do you want the things that I've given you more? Is your hand so clutching of that blessing that I've given you, you can't open it up to receive more, and you can't open up your heart to receive me? We don't know why it is that God called Abraham to this heroic task, but we do know this. Abraham, after what had to be the longest night of his life, got up and hiked 3 days out into the wilderness to do exactly what God had told him to do. And in doing so, truly became the father of our faith. That is a heroic task. That's a heroic task, to go out and say, I'm willing to give up my own son, even if I don't understand why. I'm willing to give him up because the God who gave him to me is capable of giving him back. You ever read Hebrews 11? The Hebrew writer makes it clear, and I think there's textual evidence, even the Old Testament, to say that Abraham somehow knew that even if he killed Isaac, Abraham would get him back. The Hebrew writer puts it this way. He says, Abraham reasoned, and I love the way that the Hebrew writer uses reason. He says, Abraham reasoned that the God who called him basically forth from the dead in the first place, because Abraham's good as a dead man in terms of procreation, Sarah's as good as a dead woman in terms of procreation, but God brings life out of death, that God could bring Isaac back from the dead even after he was dead. Now, I know it's easy for us to say that. We believe in the resurrection. But Abraham hadn't heard of it, not unless it's not recorded. The first hints we hear of resurrection in the Old Testament are in the books of Ezekiel. Remember the valley of dry bones. And the book of Daniel in the closing chapter, when multitudes in the dust will rise up. Before that, Read Ecclesiastes sometime and see what it says about death. See what it says about Sheol. You don't come back from there, and it's not a happy place to be. But even without knowing what we know after the resurrection of Jesus Christ, Abraham was still willing to sacrifice his son and believe simply in faith, God gave him to me and God can give him back. That is a heroic leap of faith. And did you see how the angel speaking for the Lord confirmed that? The angel speaking for the Lord said, now I know, and we'll get back to that in just a moment, and he confirms the promise. He confirms the promise. He says, through your offspring, who will be more numerous than the sands on the seashore or the stars in the sky, all nations of the earth will be what? Blessed. Does that come true? Has Abraham's seed, has his children blessed this world that we inhabit? I mean, you don't even have to go straight to Jesus Christ to go through this metric. 0.5% of the world's population is Jewish. What's the highest prize we give in science? For scientific advancement and discovery, what's its name? Nobel Prize. What percentage of Nobel Prize winners are Jewish? You would expect the answer to be, well, 0.5%, right? That would be the null hypothesis, as we like to say in statistics. The naive assumption would be that they're fairly represented just like everyone else. Can you guess what it actually is? Well, it's actually 80%. It's not quite 99.5. Look sometime at the list of people who are in business or entertainment or finance or science who are Jewish people. Such a tiny percentage of the world's population is Jewish, and yet they seem to always rise to the top. Why is that? Is it because Abraham and Sarah had great genes? Or is it because God made a promise and He kept the promise? And He's blessed the world through these children of Abraham, these children of a man who was willing to give that child up because he loved God more even than he loved his son. And there are lessons that are learned in this. There are lessons that are learned. You're probably wondering why I read Ephesians chapter 3, which talks about that through the church, God's manifold wisdom may be made known. It doesn't say, interestingly, to the world. It said what? Did you catch that? We just read it all the time and read right over it, but the manifold wisdom of God through the church would be made known to whom? The rulers and authorities where? On earth? In the heavenly realms. May I suggest that potentially one of the lessons was learned here on this mountain where Isaac was about to be sacrificed by the rulers and authorities in the heavenly realms. We are so human-centric. I am very human-centric. Maybe it's because I'm a human, right? But I'm very human-centric, and I think that all things are ultimately either about me or they're about other humans, right? This is how we typically think. And yet, when we read through Scripture, especially in the book of Ephesians, there are some tantalizing clues that a lot of what happens here on this third rock from the sun is designed to teach lessons to beings who are on a higher order than we. And that's the purpose of the church. That's one of the purposes. Don't get me wrong, God cares about humans. All right? But there are rulers and authorities in heavenly places, some of whom are aligned with God. Have you noticed that some are not? You ever notice that? We call one of them Satan. The devil also has his angels. We typically call them demons. And has it ever occurred to you that God is still teaching them something? and continues to teach them something. And maybe one of those lessons is that God is so big and so powerful, He can take a creature made of carbon, made out of the dust of the earth, and born in a bed, and get that creature to obey Him. And He can glorify that creature where one day it can stand in the very presence of God Himself. And maybe God's teaching a lesson to those who are in obedience to Him, confirming that obedience, and to those who are not in obedience to Him, that God is sovereign and God can do as He pleases, because His will is good. And it's perfect. Did you notice what the angel said? We typically interpret the angel's words as speaking for God. Now I know. Now I know. We typically, the way that I've always interpreted until the last time I read this, Rick, was God is saying, now I know. What if we took it at face value? What if the angel is saying, now I know that you can be a person of faith? You see, this cloud of witnesses that surround us, it includes those who've gone before and those who've died, but they're rulers and the authorities in the heavenly places, longing look into the things that are revealed in Christ Jesus, and we get to be a part of that. Is that not awesome? And maybe one of the entities that learned a lesson about what real faith and real obedience is was an angel himself in this story, or other angels, other servants of God, other rulers and authorities in the heavenly places. Certainly Abraham learned a lesson, right? Abraham learned a lesson that he probably had some things in him that he didn't think that he had, and he remembered who his God really was, and he learned something about that God. You see, you sacrifice your child to Chemosh or Molech, you never get that child back, because those other gods take that sacrifice quite willingly. God will never accept that. He gives the child right back to Abraham, and so much more. Do you think Abraham could have in his wildest dreams imagined what his children, his lineage, would do on this earth? And I suggest that Isaac learned a lesson that day. If it's true that when God says, this son whom you love, God is saying, you love him too much. You love him more than me. If it's true, perhaps, and this is just conjecture on my part, but if it's true that Abraham was letting his love for Isaac eclipse his love for God, can you imagine the weight that put on that young man's shoulders? You ever put anybody on a pedestal only to see him fall? You ever feel like somebody else has put you on a pedestal and you know that you have feet of clay and you're going to fall from that sometime? No human shoulders can bear the weight of idolatry. We weren't meant for that. There is only one who is worthy of our adoration and our worship. And after he got past the trauma of seeing his dad with a knife, and he had to surely go through years of serious therapy to get rid of that image. But after he got rid of that, can you imagine the blessing of knowing, my God, my dad loves God even more than he loves me. And that's the one that he really worships. And that was faith strengthening for Isaac. That was faith strengthening. We don't know a lot of the story of Isaac, but what we do know, we know that he was a faithful man of God. He was so faithful that hundreds of years later, when God appeared to Moses, he said, I'm the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Isaac got the message of who you worship, and he himself worshiped God, and he passed that on to his children. And surely we learn a lesson too. We learn a lesson that our God commands our ultimate allegiance. He is God and there is no other. We worship him and we worship him alone. But he's worthy of it. And he's faithful. And everything we give him, he gives back in so much more abundance. Child sacrifice did have to happen, though. We're about to celebrate it. But God would not let anyone do that but God himself. And lest you think that was the most cosmic form of child abuse in human history, please know that God did that knowing that he would raise his son back and give him all authority in heaven and on earth. He would taste death once, and then he would be raised to life eternal. And he did all of that so that we too could become children of God. And on Mount Calvary, the Lord did provide. He provided us a way to become his own children, and to become people who could go out into the world and say to anyone and everyone, maybe you've heard of my Father. Maybe you would like to meet him too. If you haven't named Jesus your Lord and God as your Father in a formal way, and you'd like to become a Christian and like to become a child of God, or if you've already done that and you're struggling to live that out on a daily basis and you want the prayers of this church, there is no judgment here. We are all sinners saved by the grace of God, and we would be honored to join you in your faith journey. We're going to stand up and sing a song, and if this church can help you in any way, we invite you to come forward while we stand up and sing.